This is my 137th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part will deal with more detail items for the stations on my shelf layout. Lamps, luggage, trolleys, machines, etc. This should pretty much be the last installment on populating these stations, as I don't have anything else in the wings for them, and I don't think they really need any more. They're pretty busy as they are now. I had quite a few things on hand that I'd purchased with the intent of using for the shelf stations. Platform accessories sets from Wills and Airfix, both of which I've used before, Pico model scene sets of lamps, steam error accessories, telephone box and caller and luggage, and 2 sets of mini bulb electrical lamps. I had already outfitted the stations with benches, kiosks and clocks and had populated them with figures for staff and passengers. Perhaps surprisingly, these working electrical lamps were actually cheaper than the Pico dummy lamps. The electrical lamps were $8 for 10, the Pico dummy lamps were $10 for 8. And I really only bought these lamps because they were cheap, well also because my local dealer, British Model Trains, didn't have any more of the Pico lamps in stock. I wasn't intending to actually wire these lamps up to be lit. I know it can look nice, but I'm not up for doing a whole bunch more wiring of the layout for lighting effects that I'd only use very occasionally. As the lamps came, their bases weren't fixed in any way, they just slid up and down on the poles and could have been slid off entirely, so you could set the bases to make the lamps more or less any reasonable height. I went through all of them and used liquid polycement to glue the bases so that about ½ an inch of the poles protruded from the bottom, which I felt would make the lamps a good height. Then I simply snipped off the poles below the bases, removing the wires. Sort of vandalism, I guess, but this gave me usable dummy lamps at a cheaper price than the Pico ones. I used an emery board to sand the bottoms of the bases smooth, since I would need to fix the lamps in place by gluing down the bases. So there they are with this preparation done, 20 black dummy lamps ready for use. Here's what you get when you open up one of the Pico kits and take out the contents. 8 poles on bases, 8 little transparent frames, and 8 topping pieces on a sprue. The Pico lamps can be assembled without glue, but they're a bit fiddly to do. The green parts are made of some sort of very soft, rubbery, bendy plastic. You need to put one of the transparent frames onto the top of the post, fitting its square base round the square on the post. Then you need to push one of the green topping pieces down onto the protruding top of the post, firmly, until it snugs down onto the transparent frame. This is easier said than done, as considerable force is required to push the topping pieces into position, and the poles are very bendy. I found the only way to do it was to force a thumbnail up directly under the frame and then force the top down with the other hand. I did my best with both sets of Pico lamps that I had, and so I ended up with 16 green lamps and 20 black ones. I put the lamps into a tray and took them up to the layout to put them in place. Since the platform roofs on Wenstead Station were not fixed in place, I temporarily removed them to make fitting the lamps easier. I used the black lamps on this station, spacing them out roughly evenly along both platforms. I actually only used 16, as that seemed to give me reasonable spacing. I glued the bases of the lamps down with 3-in-1 glue. This is quite effective for gluing small details in place, but it does have an annoying habit of tending to string, which will result in cobwebs of glue draped over things if you're not careful. It was a bit tricky gluing these lamps in place squarely, as their bases were rather small. I could have left part of the poles protruding below the bases, which would have helped in keeping the lamps upright, but then I'd have had to drill a hole for each lamp. I didn't do that, I just glued them with 3-in-1 on their bases and did my best to set them upright. I used the green pico lamps on Hatley Station. These were easier to glue in place, having larger bases. Again, I tried to keep the lamps spaced evenly along the platforms, but I had to make some adjustments to fit them around other things, such as the kiosks and the subway entrances. I didn't remove the platform roofs on this station, as they're plugged into holes in the platform as Hornby intended, so removing them is quite difficult. I put the roofs back on Wanstead Station after waiting some time for the glue holding the lamps in place to set. The lamps are not all that prominent, but I think that they should be there. The effect looks better without flash, but then it's hard to avoid blurring. But even with the slight blur, this is more natural and shows better how things actually look. But this is with flash again. I didn't get all of the lamps evenly vertical, and the pillars of the roofs aren't vertical at all, as without plugging into holes in the platforms they tend to spread, so they sort of lean at an angle on either side. This gent has a lamp just near his bench, which would help him to read his paper if it were illuminated. I tend to think that the black lamps actually look better than the green pico ones, but still these aren't too bad. I tried to get them into place along the centre of the platform so that it looked as though they could reasonably light things. Of course, getting this close does reveal the lack of detail in this scale, but I'm generally fairly happy with the arrangement of things. And the effect is better from a more normal distance. I had this pico kit for a telephone box. It's not really all that great. The door in particular is modelled wrongly, including what should be a fixed part above the door as part of the swinging door itself. The colour's a bit off also. There is some limited interior detail. I tried to pick the components of the phone and the shelves out in black. Here's the box assembled with the door open. As I say, the door is a bit crude. It doesn't really quite fit in place and hinge properly. It hinges, but it doesn't really fit against the hinges right, and the top part of the door shouldn't really be part of the door at all. That should be a fixed part of the box. I printed something on my PC for labels round the top of the box. I cut out my printed labels with a sharp knife and a metal ruler, and stuck them to the top of the box. I guess I made them a bit too big, really. Here's the box in situ outside Wanstead Station. I couldn't put a sign over the door, since the part where the sign is supposed to go is actually modelled into the door itself. I suppose I could have tried to modify the kit. I don't think it looks too bad, though, in place there. This was another pico set that I bought. In hindsight, I don't think I'd really bother with this one again. All of the parts are moulded in black plastic. There are parts for a clock, a rather strange, awkward clock, 4 tannoy speakers, a rack with 3 fire buckets, and a litter bin. Some painting was clearly required, though I must admit I was feeling a bit lazy with all these details and only did the minimum painting that I felt was needed. I couldn't really see how to paint the faces of the clocks. To pick out all of the numbers and minute marks would have been beyond my fine painting skills, so I just painted the face white and hoped that the moulded details would show through. I painted the fire buckets red, and I picked out the contents of the litter bin with white. The clock face isn't very satisfactory, but it was the best that I could do. The design of the clock also made it rather awkward to place. I ended up gluing it to the side of one of the roof pillars on Wanstead Station. I glued the tannoy speakers to the sides of roof pillars. I did wonder if those things above, which are parts of the pillars themselves, were intended to represent speakers. I don't know. Here's another one of the pico speakers on Wanstead Station. I put the rack with the fire buckets on the side of the Hatley Station building. These fire buckets are quite a bit smaller than the other ones I've used here and there. I also put the litter bin here near the corner of the building. The clock over the door came with the Hornby building. The LMS posters are from trackside signs. I put a couple of the Pico tannoy speakers on Hatley Station also. There's the other one by the Metcalfe kiosk. The final Pico set that I had was this one for miscellaneous pieces of luggage and a couple of trolleys. These items were moulded in variously coloured plastic, so they didn't really seem to need much painting. I did just pick out the wheels of the trolleys with black. These sprues are from the Wills Platform Accessories set. These illustrations on the packing card are the only thing in the way of instructions that comes with this set. I cut all of the parts from the sprues and cleaned off excess plastic. The parts were quite neatly moulded. Here are those Wills items glued together, small and large hand trolleys and a couple of small machines. I don't really know what those are supposed to be, maybe chocolate vending? I did a bit of painting. The motorised trolley at the back came with the Hornby Terminus station set, but not the driver. That's a Slater's figure that I painted up for this purpose. I glued legs to the signboards from the Wills set. The set doesn't actually provide legs for the signboards, only 2 sets of legs are included, and those are intended for the station name signs. But I didn't use them for the station name signs, so I've used them here for the larger advertising boards. For the smaller boards I just used some bits of plastic I had around the bench. I painted the wheels of the trolleys black. I spray painted the advertising boards brown. The Wills set includes a printed sheet of signs that you can use. I cut out those that seemed most appropriate for my pre-World War II period for the advertising boards. I glued the signs to the boards. For some reason, Wills don't seem to have managed to get the signs printed so that they actually fit the boards well. They tend to be a little too big or a little too small in almost every dimension. I also had this Airfix set of station accessories. I was almost tempted not to bother with it, as I seemed to be accumulating quite a few things. But then I figured that I might as well go ahead and use at least most of it. Here's the Airfix set unpacked. Everything was moulded in off-white styrene. The set includes a number of figures that were quite well done, but I'd already populated my stations with figures, so I didn't use these at this point. Here are the parts that I decided to use. I didn't bother with the milk churns. I actually had other churns on hand, but I don't really deal with that kind of traffic on the shelf stations. I did a bit of spray painting, making the tops of trolleys and the barrels and crates brown, the machines red and blue, and the trolley wheels black. I assembled things and did a bit more painting, picking out parts of the machines in black and silver. I used faces printed on my PC for the 2 weighing machines. I painted another Slater's seated figure as a driver for the Airfix motorised trolley. I've used the Slater's unpainted seated figures quite a bit, as there isn't all that much available in the way of seated 00 gauge figures, and the Slater's set is fairly cheap and provides figures that can be adapted for various purposes. I used 3-in-1 glue to fix the various luggage pieces onto the various trolleys, as having the loads fixed in place would make placement on the stations much easier. So here is everything I made from the Wills and Airfix sets, plus some items that came with the Hornby station set. I put all of these items into a tray and took them up to the layout for placement. I glued most of the things in place with 3-in-1 glue, though some of the larger items such as trolleys I just placed without gluing. Here you can see a weighing machine, some trolleys and an extra bench around the Hatley station building. More trolleys and luggage on the Hatley platforms. I placed the Airfix trolley train with its driver just going past the subway entrance. More things on the ends of the Hatley platforms and an advertising sign on the back fence. Another advertising sign on the back fence near the station building. A close-up of the things on the end of Hatley Platform 1. I put a vending machine on the building wall at the end of Wenstead Platform 1. On the end of Platform 2 is some luggage on a handcart and a weighing machine. An advertising sign on the fence by the subway entrance. I put the little Wills machines against roof pillars, as I really didn't know what else to do with them. As I said, I'm not even sure what they're supposed to be. Here's another advertising sign at the far end of Wenstead Platform 2. The driver is apparently taking the Hornby trolley with a crate on it off the end of the platform. Here's a view down Hatley Platform 1. A couple more machines against the roof pillars there. Here's a train's view down into Hatley Station. And here's the outer section of Hatley Station, as it will mostly be seen looking onto the layout from where it would normally be controlled. Here's the other end of Hatley from that same point of view. Here's a view into Wenstead without flash. And the end of Wenstead Platform 2 again. That's a new tree behind the end of the platform there. I picked up a set of woodland scenics trees from a local hobby shop when I was in for something else, and I placed them here and there on the shelf layout. I think for now this is about it for what I'm going to be doing in the way of detail stuff on the shelf layout, so upcoming videos will likely be a bunch of rolling stock reviews and running.